April 1941. A German aircraft touches down in Baghdad carrying a man the British intelligence services know well. Fritz Grobba, diplomat, propagandist, and the Third Reich's most influential operative in the Arab world. Within days, Iraq is in revolt. A pro-Axis government seizes power. British troops are trapped at a desert airbase surrounded by Iraqi forces. German bombers begin landing in the Middle East, and in Berlin, Adolf Hitler starts looking beyond Europe, toward the oil fields of Iraq and Iran, the Suez Canal, and the possibility of collapsing the British Empire from the south. It comes far closer to succeeding than most people realize. Today, when we think of the Second World War, we picture the beaches of Normandy, the ruins of Stalingrad, the skies over London. But while the world's attention was fixed on Europe, another war was unfolding across the Middle East. A war of coups, invasions, espionage, collapsing empires, and battles fought over the most valuable resource on Earth: oil. This was not a sideshow. It was one of the strategic centers of the entire conflict. From the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Syria, from the refineries of Abadan to the streets of Cairo, Allied and Axis powers fought for control of supply lines, pipelines, ports, and imperial lifelines that kept entire armies alive. British forces battled Iraqi nationalists outside Baghdad. Free French troops fought Vichy French soldiers in Syria, Frenchmen killing Frenchmen in a civil war inside a world war. British and Soviet armies jointly invaded neutral Iran to secure a supply corridor that would help keep the Soviet Union alive after Hitler's invasion. And in North Africa, Erwin Rommel's drive toward Egypt threatened to link all of these crises into a single strategic catastrophe. If the Axis had broken through the Middle East, the consequences could have been enormous. Britain might have lost access to vital oil supplies. The Suez Canal could have fallen. German forces advancing from North Africa and the Caucasus might have converged on the region from two directions at once. The entire balance of the war could have changed, and yet despite its importance, this front has largely vanished from popular memory. The campaigns in Iraq, Syria, Iran, Palestine, Egypt, and the Persian Gulf are rarely discussed alongside Normandy or Kursk. But the consequences of what happened there never disappeared. The governments installed and overthrown during the war shaped the political future of the Middle East. The oil infrastructure defended during these campaigns became the backbone of the modern global economy. The borders, alliances, resentments, and foreign interventions that emerged from this period still define international politics today. This is not just the story of a forgotten theater of World War II. It is the story of how the modern Middle East was forged in the shadow of the largest war in human history. Why did Nazi Germany try to establish influence in the Arab world? Why did Britain and the Soviet Union invade Iran together? How close did the Axis come to breaking Allied control of the region? And how did a series of wartime decisions made between Baghdad, Tehran, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo help shape the crises that still dominate headlines more than 80 years later? To answer those questions, we have to return to a war fought not only with tanks and bombers, but with pipelines, propaganda, secret diplomacy, and imperial ambition. A war the world forgot, but one whose consequences are still very much alive. This is the forgotten Middle East front of World War II. To understand why the Middle East mattered in the Second World War, you have to understand what the Middle East was in 1939. It was not the sovereign collection of nation-states that appears on modern maps. It was a patchwork of British mandates, French mandates, nominally independent kingdoms, and colonial arrangements dating from the end of the First World War. A system constructed not to reflect the will of the people who lived there, but to serve the strategic interests of the European powers who had partitioned the Ottoman Empire's remains at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Britain controlled Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq under League of Nations mandates. It exercised effective control over Egypt through a treaty relationship and military presence, though Egypt was nominally independent. It maintained bases in Cyprus, Aden, and along the Persian Gulf. It had treaty arrangements with the tribal leaders of what would become the modern Gulf states. France controlled Syria and Lebanon under a separate mandate. It had extensive influence in North Africa. Algeria was a formal French territory. Tunisia and Morocco were protectorates. And beneath all of it, beneath the diplomatic arrangements, the colonial administrations, and the lines drawn on maps by men in Paris and London who had in many cases never visited the places they were partitioning, lay oil. The oil fields of Iraq had been in commercial production since the 1920s. The Iraq Petroleum Company, a consortium dominated by British and Anglo-Dutch interests, extracted and transported crude through a pipeline system that ran westward to the Mediterranean coast at Haifa and Tripoli. Persian oil, extracted by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British enterprise that would eventually become BP, was processed at the massive refinery at Abadan on the Persian Gulf, the largest oil refinery in the world at the time. Together, these fields supplied a significant portion of the fuel that Britain needed to run its navy, its air force, and its mechanized army. This was not background context. This was the central strategic reality of the Middle Eastern theater. Whoever controlled Middle Eastern oil controlled the capacity of the combatants to wage war. Winston Churchill, who had as First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911 made the decision to convert the Royal Navy from coal to oil, understood this with particular clarity. The oil fields were not simply an economic asset. They were a military one, perhaps the most important one Britain possessed. Germany understood this too. Adolf Hitler's strategic thinking about the Middle East was not merely opportunistic. It was systematically integrated into his larger vision for the war. The conquest of the Soviet Union was to be accompanied by a drive into the Caucasus, toward the oil fields of Baku. A simultaneous push through North Africa, through Egypt, and across the Suez Canal was to bring German forces into the Middle East from the west. If these two thrusts could meet, if the Wehrmacht could close a pincer across Turkey or through the Levant, the result would be catastrophic for Britain. The oil would be severed. The empire would be broken. It was a realistic plan. It came closer to success than most Western histories acknowledge. Germany also possessed a significant diplomatic asset in the region: genuine anti-British sentiment. The Arab populations living under British and French mandates had been promised and then denied varying degrees of independence in the aftermath of the First World War. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which the British government expressed support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, had generated deep hostility among Palestinian Arabs and their supporters across the region. Nationalist movements in Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and Palestine viewed Britain not as a liberator, but as an occupying power. Nazi Germany cultivated these grievances with deliberate care. Fritz Grobba, fluent in Arabic, deeply versed in the region's politics, a veteran of German diplomatic postings in Baghdad and Kabul, had spent years building relationships with Arab nationalist leaders. He was not offering them freedom, he was offering them leverage against a common enemy. The distinction mattered less to some Arab leaders in 1941 than it does in retrospect. The result was a region in which the geopolitical fault lines of the Second World War intersected with local nationalist aspirations, colonial resentments, and competing visions for what the Middle East might look like after the war. It was not a simple theater. It was not a binary conflict between Allied good and Axis evil. It was a layered, multi-dimensional struggle in which the interests of great powers, colonial subjects, and regional actors collided in ways that would take decades to fully resolve. And it was about to explode. The first detonation came not in the desert, but in a city on the banks of the Tigris. On April 1st, 1941, a date that carries an irony, history has noted, A group of Iraqi military officers known as the Golden Square seized effective control of Baghdad. They forced the pro-British regent, Prince Abd al-Ela, to flee the country and installed Rashid Ali al-Gailani as Prime Minister. Rashid Ali was a nationalist lawyer who had served as Prime Minister before and who had been increasingly aligned with the Axis powers in the preceding months. The coup was not spontaneous. It had been in preparation for some time with German encouragement and the promise of German support. The timing was, from the German perspective, nearly ideal. The British were stretched thin across multiple theaters. Greece had just fallen to the Wehrmacht. The evacuation from Crete was underway. North Africa was contested. The Middle East, vast, complex, dependent on a relatively small number of British troops and advisors, was suddenly vulnerable. The British responded with characteristic pragmatism. They had a treaty with Iraq that permitted the transit of British forces through the country. They began moving troops from India through Basra in southern Iraq under the terms of this treaty. Rashid Ali, recognizing that British reinforcements would eventually tip the balance against him, ordered Iraqi forces to surround the British air base at Habbaniyah, 30 miles west of Baghdad. Habbaniyah was not primarily a combat installation. It was a training base. It held approximately 9,000 people, RAF personnel, their families, contract workers, Iraqi support staff, and a collection of aircraft that were, by 1941 standards, largely obsolete. The Iraqi forces surrounding it numbered in the thousands and possessed artillery. The siege of Habbaniyah began on May 2, 1941. By the logic of the situation, the garrison should have surrendered or been overrun. It did not. The RAF commander at Habbaniyah, Air Vice Marshal Harry George Smart, made the decision to attack rather than wait. The training aircraft, Audaxes, Oxfords, Gladiators, were armed with whatever bombs and guns could be fitted to them. On the morning of May 2nd, they went up against the Iraqi forces surrounding the perimeter. What followed was one of the more improbable engagements of the war. For 4 days, the aircraft flew continuous sorties against Iraqi positions. The Iraqi artillery, which could have devastated the base, was suppressed by this constant aerial pressure. The trainees flew missions, the instructors flew missions. Aircraft returned from sorties, were refueled and rearmed, and went back up. The pilots flew until they could barely stand. By May 6th, the Iraqi forces withdrew from the heights surrounding Habbaniyah. The siege had been broken by men in training aircraft flying against professional soldiers with artillery. But this was not the end. It was the beginning of a larger operation, a relief column pushing from Palestine through the desert toward Baghdad, British forces advancing up from Basra in the south, and, simultaneously, the first arrival of German aircraft. Germany had responded to Rashid Ali's request for aid. Luftwaffe aircraft, Heinkel, He-111 bombers and Messerschmitt, Baf 110 fighters were flown to Syrian airfields, refueled, and forward deployed to Mosul in northern Iraq. They began attacking British positions. For several days in May 1941, German aircraft and British aircraft fought in the skies above Iraq, a small-scale air campaign that is almost entirely absent from standard histories of the Luftwaffe or the RAF. The German intervention was limited by logistics. Iraq was a long way from any major Luftwaffe base, and by the preoccupations of Berlin. Hitler was weeks away from launching Operation Barbarossa. The resources required to seriously reinforce Rashid Ali's forces were not available. The window of German opportunity in Iraq was narrow, and it was closing. On May 30th, 1941, the British relief column reached the outskirts of Baghdad. Rashid Ali fled to Iran. The Golden Square officers scattered, some to Iran, some to Turkey, some eventually to Germany, where they spent the rest of the war in exile. Prince Abd al-Ela was reinstated. The pro-British government returned to power. The coup had lasted less than 6 weeks, but its implications were enormous. Germany had demonstrated both the will and a minimal capacity to project power into the Middle East through the Levant. The route through Syria, then under French control, but which France was clearly the key artery. If Germany could secure transit rights through Vichy-controlled Syria, the next crisis in the Middle East might be far harder to contain. The British knew this, and they were already moving to prevent it. The war in the desert was about to acquire a new and extraordinary dimension, one that no one outside a small circle of commanders and diplomats fully anticipated. The French were about to fight the French. In June 1940, France fell. The armistice signed by Marshal Philippe Pétain's government with Nazi Germany split France into 2 zones, an occupied north and a nominally sovereign south, governed from the spa town of Vichy. Vichy France was not an ally of Germany in the formal sense, but it was a collaborator, and its overseas territories, including the mandates of Syria and Lebanon, remained under the authority of administrators loyal to Vichy, not to the Free French forces of Charles de Gaulle. This created a situation without real parallel in the war. 2 French factions, each claiming legitimate authority, each controlling significant forces, about to be brought into direct military conflict in the hills and valleys of the Levant. The Vichy administration in Syria was headed by General Henry Dentz. He was not a fanatical collaborator in the Nazi mold. He was a professional soldier who had concluded that obedience to the Vichy government was his duty and who operated accordingly. When the German aircraft that had been supporting Rashid Ali's coup in Iraq requested transit through Syria, Dentz permitted it. When the Germans subsequently sought to expand their use of Syrian facilities, the negotiations continued. The British could not allow Syria to become a German staging area. After the fall of Crete, after the Iraq crisis, the possibility of a German-controlled Levant, with access to the Syrian coast, to the Haifa pipeline terminus, and to the land route into Iraq and Palestine, was existentially threatening. On June 8, 1941, Allied forces crossed the Syrian and Lebanese borders. The operation was designated Exporter. The forces involved were British, Australian, Indian, and Free French, the last under the command of General Georges Catroux, de Gaulle's most senior field commander. The expectation among the Free French leadership was that the Vichy troops would defect rather than fight. The Vichy troops, on the whole, did not defect. What followed was 5 weeks of combat across terrain that made North Africa look simple. The Syrian interior is not flat desert. It is a landscape of mountain ranges, deep valleys, ancient cities, and river systems. The Vichy French forces, approximately 35,000 men, were fighting on ground they knew well, in fortifications they had prepared, against an attacking force that was numerically comparable and operating on extended supply lines. The fighting was bitter and often confused. French soldiers shot at French soldiers across positions they had jointly built in the years before the war. Artillery fire from Vichy batteries was answered by artillery fire from Free French guns. At the Battle of Kissoué, south of Damascus, Free French legionnaires fought Vichy foreign legionnaires in hand-to-hand combat in a scenario that one observer described as the war's most surreal engagement. The Australians, assigned the coastal route through Tyre and Sidon toward Beirut, fought their way through a series of determined Vichy defenses with a ferocity born of frustration. They had expected a rapid advance and encountered instead a carefully managed fighting withdrawal. The campaign cost the Australians more than 1,600 casualties before it was over. Damascus fell on June 21st. Beirut held until July 12th. On July 14th, Bastille Day, in a detail that escaped no one, an armistice was signed at Acre. Dentz surrendered. Syria and Lebanon passed under Free French and British administration. The armistice contained a provision that would create lasting friction. Vichy troops who chose repatriation to France rather than joining the Free French were to be allowed to leave. The majority chose repatriation. De Gaulle was furious. He had hoped for a mass defection that would dramatically expand his forces. Instead, he received a relatively small number of recruits and watched the rest sail for home. The bitterness this produced between the Free French and their British partners, who had negotiated the armistice terms, would color Franco-British relations for the remainder of the war. But Syria and Lebanon were secured. The German route through the Levant was closed. There was, however, a third element of the Middle Eastern strategic picture that had not yet been addressed. To the east of Iraq, across the border in Iran, a nominally neutral country sat astride the most critical supply route of the entire Allied war effort. The Shah of Iran, Reza Shah Pahlavi, had maintained Iranian neutrality, but his sympathy for Germany was well known. German technical advisors and agents operated throughout the country, and the route through Iran, the Persian corridor, was the only reliable path for supplying the Soviet Union from the south. Something had to be done about Iran, and what was done changed the country forever. On August 25, 1941, British and Soviet forces crossed the Iranian border simultaneously. It was one of the more extraordinary military operations of the Second World War, not because of its scale or complexity, but because of what it represented. Two ideologically opposed great powers fighting a common enemy, invading a neutral country in coordinated fashion with almost no prior warning. Iran had declared its neutrality at the outset of the war. Reza Shah Pahlavi had been cultivating a modernization program for his country since seizing power in 1921, and part of that program had involved bringing in German engineers, technicians, and advisors in significant numbers. By 1941, an estimated 2,000 German nationals were working in Iran in various capacities. British and Soviet intelligence services assessed that this German presence was not purely economic, that it represented a potential intelligence and sabotage network that could be activated to disrupt Iranian oil production and infrastructure if Germany's strategic situation required it. After Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the calculation became urgent. The Soviet Union was absorbing catastrophic losses. It needed supplies, weapons, vehicles, food, raw materials, and it needed them at a scale that could only be achieved through sustained logistical effort. The route through the Arctic to Murmansk was hazardous and limited in capacity. The route through the Pacific was too exposed. The route through Iran, overland from the Persian Gulf ports, north through the country, and across the Soviet border at Julfa and Bandar Shah, was geographically ideal. It required only that the route be controlled. The British occupied the southern and central portions of Iran. The Soviets occupied the north. The operation encountered limited resistance. The Iranian armed forces were not equipped to fight two great powers simultaneously, and resistance was localized and quickly suppressed. Within days, effective Iranian sovereignty had been suspended over most of the country. Reza Shah was given a stark choice. He was asked to expel the German nationals, to submit to Allied military administration, and to cooperate with the logistical program the Allies required. He refused the terms initially, negotiated, and ultimately abdicated. He was forced from the throne on September 16, 1941, replaced by his 22-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the man who would rule Iran until the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Reza Shah was transported first to Mauritius, then to South Africa, where he died in 1944. He was 66 years old. He had built a modern Iranian state from the remnants of a decaying dynasty and had been removed from it by foreign powers who found his neutrality inconvenient. His forced abdication is a moment that Iranian national memory has never fully processed. It is simultaneously a story of colonial imposition and of a ruler whose relationships with fascist Germany made his position untenable. What followed was the Persian Corridor, one of the greatest logistical achievements of the entire war. Between 1941 and 1945, approximately 5 million tons of supplies passed through Iran to the Soviet Union. American Lend-Lease trucks, aircraft, railway locomotives, ammunition, food, steel, and hundreds of other categories of material. The Trans-Iranian Railway, built largely under Reza Shah's modernization program using German engineering, became the spine of the operation. The Americans took over management of the railway in 1942 and ran it with military efficiency, vastly increasing its capacity. The Persian Corridor supplied roughly 1/4 of all the Lend-Lease material that reached the Soviet Union during the war. Historians have debated how much this contributed to Soviet survival and ultimate victory. The Soviet leadership, including Stalin, acknowledged its importance explicitly. Without the trucks, tanks, and food that came through Iran, the Soviet capacity to sustain the grinding campaigns of 1942 and 1943 would have been materially reduced. This is not a footnote. This is a central element of why the Allies won the Second World War, and it happened in a country that most accounts of the conflict barely mention. Iran also became, during the war years, a hub of Allied intelligence operations, diplomatic maneuvering, and great power competition. The Tehran Conference of November 1943, the first meeting of Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, was held in the Iranian capital for a reason. It was conveniently accessible to all three leaders, and it was under Allied military control. The decisions made at Tehran shaped the post-war world, the timing of D-Day, the future of Poland, the structure of the United Nations. They were made in a city that had been under occupation for 2 years. But while the supply lines through Iran were being secured, the desert war to the west was approaching its decisive moment. And in the western desert of Egypt and Libya, the campaign that would determine whether Germany or Britain controlled the Middle East was about to reach its climax. Erwin Rommel arrived in North Africa in February 1941, commanding what was initially a small German expeditionary force designated the Afrika Korps. He had been sent to stabilize a collapsing Italian position in Libya, not to launch a major offensive. Within weeks, he had done both, and considerably more. His first offensive, launched in March 1941 in defiance of his orders, pushed the British back across Cyrenaica and trapped an Australian garrison in Tobruk. He had moved faster, thought more boldly, and adapted more fluidly to the conditions of desert warfare than his superiors had anticipated or his opponents had prepared for. The battle for North Africa between 1941 and 1943 has been told many times from many angles, but its connection to the broader Middle Eastern theater is often treated as background color rather than strategic core. In fact, the North African campaign and the campaigns in Iraq, Syria, and Iran were not separate conflicts. They were different elements of a single strategic struggle for the Middle East. If Rommel had broken through at El Alamein in the summer and autumn of 1942, which he came agonizingly close to doing, the consequences would have extended far beyond Egypt. British forces in Palestine would have been threatened. The oil pipeline from Iraq to Haifa would have been in danger. The entire position in the Levant, just secured from Vichy, France, would have been outflanked. The Persian Corridor, already operating, might have been severable from the west. This was the strategic nightmare that haunted Allied planning throughout 1942. The Middle East was not simply a theater where British and German forces happened to be fighting. It was the keystone of British imperial power, the guardian of Allied oil supplies, and the hinge on which the entire southern approach to Europe turned. The man who stopped Rommel's first advance on Cairo was General Claude Auchinleck. Auchinleck is one of the more underappreciated figures of the war, a commander of genuine ability who was ultimately replaced before he could reap the harvest of his efforts. In July 1942, at the First Battle of El Alamein, it was Auchinleck who stabilized a front that was dissolving, who personally drove to threatened points to stiffen resistance, and who ultimately halted the Afrika Korps at a defensible line roughly 60 miles from Alexandria. He was relieved of command in August 1942. His replacement, General Bernard Montgomery, would command British forces at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October and November 1942, the battle that ended German offensive capacity in North Africa. Montgomery's victory at El Alamein has become, in British memory, one of the war's defining moments. Churchill called it the end of the beginning. The church bells rang across Britain for the first time since 1940. It was, genuinely, a turning point. But it was a turning point that had been prepared by 2 years of fighting and in which the strategic coherence of the Middle Eastern theater, the connections between North Africa, the Levant, Iraq, and Iran, had been maintained against continuous pressure through a series of individual operations that have largely been forgotten separately and were never adequately understood together. The soldiers who fought across this theater came from across the British Empire and beyond. Australians, Indians, South Africans, New Zealanders, Poles, Czechs, Greeks, Palestinians, Jewish volunteers who would go on to form the core of the Israeli military, and, increasingly, Americans. The diversity of the Allied force in the Middle East reflected the global nature of the conflict in ways that the European theater, dominated by the major Western powers, did not. For the people of the region, Arabs, Persians, Jews, various minorities, the war was not simply a contest between foreign powers. It was an event that would determine the political future of territories they lived in, had lived in for centuries, and had varying claims upon. Their relationship to the combatants was complex, contested, and in some cases contradictory. Arab nationalist sentiment was not monolithic. Some leaders saw Britain as a lesser evil. Others saw Germany as a potential liberator. Most were primarily concerned with their own people's prospects in a post-war world none of them controlled. These competing interests would not be resolved by the outcome of the war. They would be deferred, and deferral in the Middle East has its own kind of cost. The war was moving toward its conclusion, but in the Middle East, the conclusion was not really an ending. It was a rearrangement, and some rearrangements are as consequential as the conflicts that produce them. The British mandate for Palestine was, throughout the war years, a territory in a state of managed crisis. The decade before the war had seen a major Arab revolt from 1936 to 1939 against both British administration and Jewish immigration. The revolt had been suppressed at considerable cost, and in its aftermath, the British had issued the White Paper of 1939, sharply restricting Jewish immigration to Palestine and signaling an intention to eventually establish a unitary Arab majority state. This policy was a direct response to Arab nationalist pressure and to Britain's need to maintain Arab goodwill in the increasingly tense geopolitical situation. It was also, from the perspective of European Jews, catastrophically timed. The White Paper went into effect just as the persecution of Jews in Germany and occupied Europe was intensifying toward its ultimate form. The doors to the one territory where the Zionist movement had established a meaningful foothold were being closed at precisely the moment when the need to flee Europe was becoming a matter of life and death. The Jewish community of Palestine, the Yishuv, responded to this situation with a characteristic combination of pragmatism and defiance. The mainstream Zionist leadership, under David Ben-Gurion, adopted a policy articulated with striking clarity. Fight the war as if there is no White Paper. Fight the White Paper as if there is no war. This meant supporting the British war effort against the Axis. The Yishuv had no illusions about what a German victory would mean for Jews anywhere. While simultaneously resisting British immigration restrictions, and continuing to build the institutional infrastructure of a future Jewish state. Approximately 30,000 Palestinian Jews enlisted in British forces during the war. They served in the Middle East, in North Africa, and in Europe. In 1944, a Jewish brigade was formally constituted within the British Army, a distinct unit fighting under a flag bearing the Star of David. The brigade served in Italy in the final phase of the war. The intelligence and commando operations that the Yishuv conducted during the war are a separate and remarkable chapter. The Palmach, the full-time strike force of the Haganah, the main Jewish paramilitary organization, conducted operations behind Vichy lines in Syria before Operation Exporter, gathered intelligence on Iraqi oil infrastructure, and prepared for the possibility of a German breakthrough into Palestine. Members of this force would go on to command the Israeli military in 1948 and for decades afterward. At the same time, the more militant factions of the Zionist movement, particularly the Irgun and the Lehi, known to the British as the Stern Gang, maintained their opposition to British rule even during the war. This created an extraordinary situation in which some Jewish organizations were fighting alongside the British while others were intermittently fighting against them. The Lehi assassinated Lord Moyne, the British Minister of State for the Middle East, in Cairo in November 1944. The assassination was condemned by the mainstream Zionist leadership, but it illustrated the fractured nature of Jewish political organization in Palestine and the escalating tension that would erupt into open conflict after the war's end. The Arab population of Palestine watched all of this with a mixture of anxiety and frustration. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, had fled Palestine in 1937 after the collapse of the Arab Revolt and had spent the intervening years in Iraq, where he had connections to the Rashid Ali coup, and subsequently in Germany, where he met Hitler in November 1941 and spent the war years broadcasting Arab-language propaganda for the Axis. His collaboration with the Nazi regime remains a deeply contentious element of Palestinian history, discussed differently in different contexts. His wartime activities did not represent the full range of Arab political behavior. Many Arabs served in Allied forces. Many more simply tried to survive a war being fought around them. But they colored British and, later, Israeli perceptions of Arab nationalism for years afterward. The war would end in 1945. The British would remain in Palestine. The tensions that had been suspended, compressed, or simply deferred by wartime necessity would resurface, rapidly, violently, and with consequences that reached far beyond the borders of that small territory. But the war itself was not yet over, and as it moved toward its conclusion, the Middle Eastern theater was producing one more strategic surprise, one that neither the British, the Americans, nor the Soviets had fully anticipated. The question of what the Middle East would look like after the war had already become the war's next conflict. By 1944, the decisive military questions of the Middle Eastern theater had largely been resolved. North Africa was in Allied hands. Syria and Lebanon were under Free French and British administration. Iraq had a pro-British government, Iran was occupied, and the Persian corridor was operating at full capacity. The immediate strategic threats that had made the region so dangerous in 1941 had been addressed. What had not been resolved were the political questions, and political questions in the Middle East of 1944 and 1945 had a way of becoming military ones with disorienting speed. The United States had arrived in the Middle East as a significant actor during the war. American involvement had begun with Lend-Lease and the management of the Persian corridor, but it had expanded into something more substantial. American engineers and businessmen had assessed the oil resources of Saudi Arabia, where the Arabian-American Oil Company, Aramco, had been operating since 1938, and had concluded that the reserves there were of a scale that dwarfed anything previously known. In February 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt met with King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia aboard the USS Quincy in the Great Bitter Lake, a meeting that established the framework for the American-Saudi relationship that has defined Middle Eastern geopolitics ever since. Britain was already being displaced. Its military prestige had been damaged by the early disasters of the war: the fall of Singapore, the early reversals in North Africa, the retreats from Greece and Crete. Its financial position had been drained by the cost of 6 years of total war. The empire that had organized the Middle Eastern theater in 1939 was not the same empire that emerged from the war in 1945. It was poorer, more cautious, and increasingly aware that the era of formal imperial control was ending. The promises that Britain had made, or that various parties believed Britain had made, during the First World War and its aftermath were about to come due. The contradiction between the commitments to Arab independence, Jewish national home, and British strategic interest that had defined the mandate system was no longer manageable. The survivors of European Jewish communities, those who had endured the ghettos, the camps, the death marches, were moving toward Palestine in large numbers. The British were trying to stop them in accordance with the White Paper policy. The Yishuv's armed organizations were resisting that effort with escalating intensity. In Syria and Lebanon, the Free French were discovering that the populations they administered had no intention of accepting continued French rule. Lebanese nationalists had declared independence in 1943. Syrian nationalists did the same. The French under de Gaulle were initially resistant. De Gaulle's vision of French greatness did not readily accommodate the loss of the Levant mandates. In May 1945, French forces bombarded Damascus in an effort to suppress Syrian nationalist demonstrations. The British intervened, ordering French forces to stand down, essentially forcing France to accept the independence of Syria and Lebanon. It was the end of the French Levant. Iran would experience its own post-war turbulence. The Soviet occupation of northern Iran did not immediately end when the war ended. Soviet forces remained in place, supporting the establishment of breakaway republics in Iranian Azerbaijan and Kurdistan in late 1945, a crisis that became one of the first confrontations of the Cold War. It was resolved only after significant American diplomatic pressure in 1946, when the Soviet forces finally withdrew. The experience left Iran deeply suspicious of both Soviet intentions and of the great powers in general, a suspicion that fed the nationalist movement led by Mohammad Mossadegh, who nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1951. The subsequent British and American organized coup that removed Mossadegh in 1953, Operation Ajax, is one of the most consequential covert operations of the 20th century. Its consequences are still playing out. Iraq's trajectory was similarly shaped by the wartime experience. The pro-British governments installed after the Rashid Ali coup maintained power for over a decade, but Iraqi nationalism, the same currents that had produced the 1941 coup, did not disappear. The revolution of 1958 overthrew the Hashemite monarchy and killed the young king. It was the beginning of a period of Iraqi political instability that moved through various phases until the American invasion of 2003. Palestine became Israel in May 1948, in a war that immediately followed the end of the British Mandate. The Palestinian refugee crisis that resulted, approximately 700,000 Palestinians displaced from their homes, created a wound that has shaped Middle Eastern politics for 75 years and shows no sign of healing. These are not distant consequences. They are the direct, traceable legacy of the wartime Middle Eastern theater, of the decisions made, the promises issued, the borders drawn, and the political structures imposed or dismantled between 1940 and 1945. The Forgotten Front was not just a theater of war. It was a furnace in which the modern Middle East was forged, and the metal it produced is still burning. There is a reason this theater of the war has been forgotten in the popular histories. The story of the Middle East in the Second World War does not fit cleanly into the narrative frameworks that Western memory has built around the conflict. It is not the story of clear moral opposites, the democratic West against totalitarian evil. It is the story of empires defending their interests, of colonial subjects navigating between oppressors, of great power calculations that valued strategic resources over human rights, of promises made and broken in the same breath. This is not comfortable. It is not the story of a good war. It is, however, the true story. And its truths have consequences that extend directly into the present moment. The borders of modern Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories are the borders of the mandate system, modified by war, by treaty, and by population movement, but recognizably descended from the lines drawn by European powers in the 1920s. The political legitimacy of those borders has been contested almost continuously since they were drawn. The contestation has taken the form of coups, wars, insurgencies, occupations, and revolutions that constitute the modern history of the region. The oil infrastructure that the Allies fought to secure and control became the backbone of the global energy economy in the second half of the 20th century. The relationship between Western powers and Middle Eastern oil-producing states, the dependency, the manipulation, the periodic ruptures, is the direct descendant of the wartime arrangements. The 1973 oil embargo, the Iranian Revolution, the Gulf War, the post-2001 interventions. All of these events occur within a strategic framework that was established during the years from 1940 to 1945. The Iranian-American relationship, still defined by mutual suspicion and periodic crisis, has its root in the 1941 occupation, the 1953 coup, and the accumulated resentments of a country that experienced the Second World War not as liberation, but as a new form of foreign domination. However strategically necessary that domination was to the Allied war effort. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the most durable and most observed political crisis of the 20th and early 21st centuries, grew directly from the conditions of the wartime mandate, from the competing promises of the British government, from the desperation of Holocaust survivors seeking refuge, and from the failure of the international community to devise a solution that addressed the legitimate claims of both peoples. None of this is to suggest that the men and women who fought in the Middle Eastern theater bear personal responsibility for the political failures that followed. The soldiers at Habbaniyah, the sailors on the Persian Gulf convoys, the Australian infantrymen fighting through the hills of Lebanon, they were doing what soldiers do in service of objectives that were, in their most fundamental form, legitimate. Stopping Nazi Germany from securing Middle Eastern oil, from encircling the Soviet Union, from breaking British imperial power at its most vulnerable point. These were real strategic imperatives. The failure to translate military success into just political outcomes was a failure of statesmanship, not of soldiering. But forgetting the theater entirely, treating it as a sideshow, a curiosity, a collection of minor campaigns that can be summarized in a paragraph or omitted from a history, is its own kind of failure. It allows the consequences to accumulate without explanation. It makes the Middle East seem perpetually, inexplicably volatile, as if the region's conflicts arise from some inherent cultural dysfunction rather than from specific, traceable historical causes. The battles of 1941 in the Iraqi desert, the fighting in the Syrian hills, the occupation of Iran, the struggles in the Western desert, these are not ancient history. They are the immediate past of a region that remains 80 years later at the center of global politics. Understanding what happened there and why and what it produced is not an academic exercise. It is a necessary part of understanding where we are. The soldiers of the Forgotten Front left no monuments comparable to Normandy. Their campaigns produced no holidays, No films of comparable reach, no anniversaries observed by heads of state. The ground they fought on is now cities, oil fields, and contested borders. Their battles have been absorbed into the landscape they were fought over, invisible to those who walk across it. But the consequences of what they did, and what was done in their name, and what was promised and not delivered, and what was taken and not returned, those consequences are not invisible at all. They are everywhere. They are still here. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.